Reni Eddo-Lodge has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Independent, BuzzFeed. She contributed to The Good Immigrant, an anthology edited by Nikesh Shukla, and hosts the podcast About Race, featuring key voices from anti-racist activism. We're here today at the Bloomsbury Literary Festival in Montreal to talk about her bestseller, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thanks for having me.
Perhaps I can hit you with some requests for definitions.
Okay.
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule. In the context of the book, really, it's a strategy to keep people who don't have much fighting each other rather than looking at the people who have a lot. A colonial strategy.
What about colorblindness?
Well, I think colorblindness in the context of the book, what I try to say is pretending not to see race socially. That's what colorblindness is, pretending not to see race socially, avoiding looking at how it functions socially when it comes to inequality.
Structural racism.
So, in the book I cite a lot of data that really points to drastic inequalities in quite a few, public institutions, employment, housing, healthcare, higher education, and education in general. And I call those drastic racial inequalities structural racism. It's more subtle than abuse in the street.
Yes, not one-off. It's not a one-off incident.
Indeed, it's not an isolated incident, yeah.
And it's a collective mindset, a world you live in, the way in which you experience your environment.
Yeah, but also the way that power is organised, I suppose. And it gets in the way of people's life chances. Particularly when it comes to some of the stats around education. There was a study that I cited in the book from the Department for Education in the UK that showed that 11-year-olds who are doing their exams in the hope of getting into secondary school, black 11-year-olds were more likely to be marked down by their own teachers, and it was something that was rectified when somebody who didn't teach them marked their papers. And that's an example of structural racism that could affect what kind of secondary school that a child goes to, which will in turn affect what kind of university that person might be able to access, which might in turn affect what kind of job that they go on to get, which would affect their earnings, their class, the access to resources, etc., etc. So,
you position your book as a tool. You provide historical knowledge, political backdrop. How can that be used as a tool?
Well, I think for readers, many of whom know their own personal experience but feel somewhat isolated when it comes to articulating it, I want the book to be able to back them up with data and evidence and language that they can use to speak about not only what they are personally experiencing but also the world at large and the inequality at hand.
Yeah, I brought this up in a session that you were speaking at yesterday. And for me, one of the most powerful tools is statistics. Statistics that prove that racism is present. And there was a study that was done of black versus white applicants for mortgages in the United States. And it's clearly evident that, and so this particular program took that data to the banks and confronted the banks. It seems to me that that's a really powerful tool because banks don't want to be embarrassed like that in public.
Definitely. A lot of people expected me to write a book that was going to be focused on my personal experience, but I come from a background of journalism and worked in a think tank for a short amount of time, found myself trawling through reports. And I think for those of us who are invested in equality, it's important to skill up. You can't just be invested in equality. You have to be invested, you have to have the skills to be able to analyse it. And I think that when it comes to narratives of personal experience, then I wouldn't ever seek to do down somebody who situates their opposition in that space, it can be easily dismissed because it's just one person's subjective experience.
Yep,
And
it's anecdotal and...
For me, it's really important that whatever I say about my personal experience is backed up by the large-scale evidence. And there is so much evidence and so much data out there.
And yet you talk about the fact that much of it is being suppressed. Like, for example, the relationship between blacks and police.
I mean, it's so strange because when I was doing that research, a lot of that stuff happened less than 3 decades ago in Britain, and it wasn't like it wasn't common knowledge then, but it just didn't get solidified into the canon of what the country thinks of itself today, And I remember when I was in the British Library and the Black Cultural Archives in South London, in Brixton, gathering that data. A lot of it was on, mainstream news at the time. But it had all sort of been just, I don't really know, it just wasn't part of the country's understanding of itself. And young people didn't know that these things had happened.
And why is that?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is trauma from the people who went through it. The older generation who lived through it, who were traumatized by that treatment and didn't want to speak of it again because, it's a psychological thing. Sometimes you go through something so tough, so difficult that you just don't want to address it. And actually, post-book publication, there were some people who had gone through horrific things, horrific racism in the last few decades in Britain who said to me, why are you bringing this up?
Well, because they think things are okay now?
No, rather that they just didn't want to have to face that pain,
Right.
So I think there's that. And then I also think that there is just like in terms of knowledge production, so outside of the community who face that like discrimination, the people who essentially like produce and reproduce knowledge, just not very diverse at all.
So you're talking about journalists?
Yeah, journalists,
academics,
authors. Like you could fit all of the black women academics in Britain into one vehicle. That's how few that there are.
Yeah.
And so there just weren't enough to be able to make some of those stories that I talk about in the book front and center.
In their research, I guess. Right?
Yeah, in their research or like in the ways, like the country thinks about itself. And that's not to say that coverage hadn't happened. So, for example, I write about the Bristol bus boycott in the book. And in Bristol, it's a widely understood story, that has been, spoken about at schools. And I actually went to go and see the instigator of the Bristol bus boycott speak in Bristol about 5 years ago, He's still doing the rounds, at least he was then. That story hadn't disseminated outside of that local community, which is so strange to me that, Paul Stevenson was doing that work around the same time that Martin Luther King Jr. was doing his work in the States, and yet MLK Jr.'s story was national, but Paul Stevenson's story was local. And I think that really speaks to a failure, I think, of the British curriculum to own those stories as our own.
You cite some historical facts, and the one that blew me away was that there were 11 million black Africans that were shipped over to the States to work on cotton farms and such. That's a huge number.
I think another number that people sort of reckon with after they read the book is that slavery as an institution lasted for longer than it's been abolished. Sometimes it's hard to be able to conceptualize numbers. But when we think about the ways in which people talk about slavery now, like, it's so long ago, the fact that it lasted for longer than it's been abolished, you're like, wow, that really, I can't quite believe that we as a society have shifted so dramatically, considering that it's a drop in the ocean of history. I kind of feel like my job as a writer is to try to illustrate those numbers, Numbers can be cold and distant and abstract, and it's hard to be able to, sometimes it's hard to grasp what the reality of those numbers actually mean.
Well, you illustrate it, or you use the term black cattle, which again, that's a very powerful image, and and I don't know if this is offensive or not for me to say it, but it puts me in the mind of how humans are currently treating animals. Now that the animal rights movement is, it seems to me that's going to be the next big thing, maybe in 50 years or something.
I mean, I don't think that's offensive. Actually, I'm familiar with black vegan animal rights writers and thinkers. There's a writer named Afko. She's African American, who draws those parallels because, you know, she wrote a piece that I came across on the internet years ago called Notes from the Human Animal Border. She makes the argument, I think quite convincingly, because that quote that you used in the book, that you just used, black cattle, that's not my words, that's the words of a slave
That's
trader.
what they were calling, that's what slave traders were calling their product.
And what I think argues incredibly convincingly is that, you know, for those of us who've been racialized, we were designated as less than human.
And that's how you were treated.
That humanity was built, the concept of humanity, and, you know, you can look at things like race science, eugenics, was built off a white male ideal. And
well, what you say is, to be white is to be human, universal. I only know this because I'm not one.
Indeed. Well, I think, you know, going back to Af's work, which has been a great source of inspiration for me, she makes the argument really well that the exploitation of humans designated less than human by people who designated themselves superior is exactly the same lines as how, you know, we treat animals. I think that there are some vegan activists who can make that argument in a very crass and offensive way, but I don't think that's what Af is doing. She's making an argument about the use of other living beings.
One of the things that really pisses me off is when someone comes across as superior and tries to make me feel stupid. So I can only imagine how difficult it must be to sort of live with a whole white race. You know, maybe you think that that's what they think. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but
and as I say, that's one of the things that in my life pisses me off the most. So again, if you're walking around and you have to kind of think they're all thinking that I'm stupid, that must be you must be angry a lot of the time.
Well, I must say that's not what I think.
Okay.
I don't like to make assumptions about what anybody thinks about me.
Right.
I'm too busy thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner that evening, you know. So.
But again, you talk about a collective mindset.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think that in terms of my one-on-one interactions with people, I don't allow that to be the front and center of my mind because, you know, I think life would be difficult to live if that was the case. But I am used to being underestimated, I think. I am used to being underestimated.
That can be actually a positive.
I think so.
Some ways.
I think so, you know. I sometimes think about when I started this book and when it was first published, a lot of people said to me, even friends, I didn't expect it to be this well researched. I didn't expect it to be this. I didn't expect it to be that. You know?
Yeah.
I am quite used to being underestimated, I think, which I don't really find offensive. It just gives me more leeway to shock people in terms of in terms of the quality and strength of the work, I suppose. But, you know, everyday people, I don't move around the world thinking that people are discriminating against me. I mean, I recognise it when it happens more directly, but it's not something that I anticipate, because I think if I did, life would just be very difficult for me to navigate, and, you know, I have to look after my sanity and mental health, you know.
Yeah. The publishing industry is pretty white.
Yeah, it's very much so, yeah. I mean, I feel I lucked out with, you know, Bloomsbury in Britain. I lucked out. I found myself working with a brilliant editor, and a whole team at Bloomsbury who were hugely like enthusiastic about the work that I was doing and really got behind it.
But they're all white, or mostly?
Mostly, with the exception of one of the editors I worked with, Angelique. She's not white. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, I remember one of the members of staff at Bloomsbury, when I first went in for a meeting with them, said was like, well, what do you think about us all around the table? There was a few of them, we're all white. And I said, yeah, but this is the rule, not the exception, and so I am cognizant, is that a word, of...
It's a good one, yeah.
Of the environment that I was publishing the book in, and I was happy to work with a publisher who didn't seek to compromise or water down any of the work that I was trying to do, and sought only to facilitate the message and get it out as in the sharpest way possible.
You do raise the topic of quotas in the book. What do you think about those?
Well, I mean, when you read the book, you see that I don't really come down hard for them, but I do explain.
Well, there was a situation in the NFL. Where the fact that so many of the players are black and so few of the managers and the coaches are black, and there was the Rooney Rule, was it?
The Rooney Rule, yes.
Which basically just said, if you're going to hire someone, make sure you interview at least one black candidate, right?
Well, this is the thing. I think I'm not hugely pro quota. I mean, if push comes to shove, I'll say yes, I'm pro quota, but I'm not going out organising and campaigning for them. What I'm really anti is the opposition to quotas, because I feel, and that's what I tried to do in the book, was really debunk and challenge all of the opposition to quotas, because it often comes from a pretty racist place, claiming that people who aren't white aren't even qualified, or that in all circumstances, if somebody who's hired who isn't white, then they're not going to have the qualifications and they're just going to be some random person, so...
And it's giving an unfair advantage too, that's the other argument, I guess.
Yeah, and what the case I tried to make in the book is that an unfair advantage already exists in the homogeneity of the people who already occupy the position.
Yeah,
so,
and you're just trying to balance things.
Yeah, exactly, level the playing field. Yeah. Now, I'm not a politician, so I'm never going to say, I think that quotas should look like this in this form and blah, 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 and I'm not going to say that.
No.
Even though I'm often pushed simply because of the book that I've written. But yeah, I personally don't have a massive problem with them.
Okay. I'm going to get personal here and talk about Twitter.
Okay, go ahead.
And we'll see what comes of that. This was about a year ago. There was a tweet that came out that said, I know that he's a poet, white poet, and it said something like, listen up, whiteies. When a black woman is speaking about her experience of racism, don't chime in with your own experiences with discrimination. They aren't, and then the implication was they're not as important or as painful, and they don't compare.
Who said that?
This is just someone on Twitter, a white poet. And I didn't like being lectured like that, so I responded with, they're just trying to be empathetic, number one. And number two, people who've suffered with mental health, there's a stigma that they have to deal with, which is very painful, and it's discrimination. And people who have disabilities have great challenges and deal with discrimination all the time. And then what happened is I got, what's the term when you get
people call it like a pylon.
A pylon.
Yeah.
And a couple of people called me a piece of shit, a racist. Maybe I was stirring it up just a tiny little bit, and largely because another white guy I thought, overstepped himself. I just say the whole thing just sort of bugged me, and I just wonder, if someone tries to bring up other kinds of discrimination while you're talking about racism, Does that annoy you? Does that undermine? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think first off, Twitter's just a really bad place to have political conversations. I know I tried for like 6 years and then stopped and
Right.
put all the work that I was trying to do online into a book instead, because I think, 140 or 280 characters, it's not enough to make a full case. The anecdote reminds me of, I once got in trouble at a family function because, a relative who was much older, he'd really hurt his knee and he was limping or walking on crutches or something, and he tried to talk to me about it, and I started responding saying, oh yeah, that's like when I sprained my ankle. And I got a blowback from family members who said, you weren't really listening to his pain or really appreciating that while you also had been in pain at that time, you sprained your ankle. And
you're just trying to empathize, I would imagine.
I'd sprained my ankle, both ankles, numerous times as a child.
Yeah.
And I sort of felt quite put out by that. But then, many years later, I was like, okay, what he was dealing with was different. And for him, I think the best thing at that time would have been for me to say, I'm really sorry, or listened and asked, what can I do to help him move around the house with crutches a little bit more. Mm-hmm. All of that to say that it taught me that listening can also be empathy, Mm-hmm. Listening can be a form of empathy.
Without trying to chime in yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And it was a harsh lesson to learn, because I'm always keen to talk about the times when I've sprained my ankles, and sometimes both at one time. It's a silly anecdote, I suppose, but
yeah. How does it deal with racism? How does that work for you? If you're bringing up an example of how discrimination affected your life, and then someone says who's not black but brings up their example, how does that come down with you?
I suppose my question is the intent. It's is it to suggest that other people have struggles too? Because I think the person who's speaking about racism isn't implying that other people don't have struggles. Mm. Sometimes people just want to vent or to, just be heard and believed. And I think sometimes it can be received as, when people say, oh yeah, and there's other struggles too, it can be received as, oh, you're not being believed, or this isn't valid.
Or you're putting down my struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I come from a background of feminist activism too, and when women talk about domestic violence, sometimes men will chime in and be like, yeah, men, get domestic violence too. And I started to wonder, I thought, are you having this conversation about domestic violence against men independently of this conversation about domestic violence against women, or is it always just in opposition to?
Right. Yeah.
Because if it's independently of, and you're doing your advocacy and stuff, then that's great. But if it's always in opposition to, then I'm a bit like, is this something you care about, or is it not? I don't know, anyway.
Right.
But yeah, people want to be heard and believed and listened to, and I've had to do an awful lot of humbling myself whilst doing this work. I think particularly with people who are transgender, and actually specifically people who are disabled. The humbling that I've done with myself when it comes to learning from disability activists has been shocking. It's been, I talk about structural barriers in my book, but is there anything more structural than the physical makeup of a building?
Yes.
I've learned so much. It's been so humbling, and it's required me to just be quiet and listen.
Yeah. Just one more quick Twitter example, and it was connected to this, and it was about empathy, and the topic of books came up, which is the topic of our podcast, of course. And I cited the fact that when I was 13 or 14, I read a book called Black Like Me, which is written by a white guy, John Howard Griffin, who dyed his skin really dark black. Oh yeah, I've heard of this book. Yeah, for me, it was one of the most moving, influential books I'd ever read. And the fact that this man, now there's rumors that he died of cancer as a result of, but I don't think that's the case. But anyway, again, I mentioned this on Twitter, and my choice of book was derided because it was a white guy appropriating black experience. And I was told to read James Baldwin and some, black writers, if that's what I wanted to get. And as I say, that also sort of, it's just, this is a white person trying to empathize, and yet he's criticized for doing that. And I'm criticized for, I've read Baldwin. I've got the book here with me right now. But I just wonder your reaction to that whole thing.
Well, again, I'm not watching every Twitter argument that you have. So I can't speak to the specifics. But yeah. I came across that book actually in an Airbnb in Sydney in Australia, and I thought, what a wacky idea.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wondered what the publishing landscape was at the time.
1961 it was published.
I see. I was like, were they really... This is so, what? First, a commitment to the cause to give yourself cancer in order to work out the kind of discrimination that black people face.
But, he worked in anti-racism his whole life. He was very, very serious about it.
I had no doubt about it, to go and dye your skin like that.
Yeah.
I could also imagine, it wouldn't fly today. I think a lot of people would find it very offensive. If the book worked as an empathy vehicle for you, then in my opinion that's a good thing.
That's what I thought.
I think as long as you're also reading black writers and not just white people who dyed themselves black, then
right.
And I'm actually curious to read it, although I don't know if I should, because I feel that the concept is just a little bit too strange for me, a little bit too strange. Even just conjuring the image in my head,
Yeah.
he must have looked so weird.
He must have. But no, I think he really did look like a black person, though. It wasn't, I guess his features...
What did he dye himself? What dyed it? I need to
I didn't even know what he used. Yeah, how did he do it?
But there is a power question here, and the question is, at the time that he was dyeing himself black and getting this publishing deal and stuff, and did black writers who were attempting to write about the black experience have the same access to publication as he did at the time?
Interesting.
Because I could see, I don't know what the answer is, but if it would have been harder for a black writer to write about their experiences in America at the time than it was for a white man to dye himself black and write about the experience, then that's a problem.
Yeah. You referenced the fact that not much changed between the Brixton riots in 1985 and then the riots in 2011, and you suggest that the underlying problems need to be tackled. So what are those?
I think real antagonism between young black people in particular and the police, which still exists, I don't know if you've been paying attention to some of the headlines coming out of the UK at the moment, but there's real problems with young, I'm not going to say just young black people, I'd say young poor people who all tend to be racialized, black, white, Asian, and young youth violence. Well, I think one of the most troubling things about youth violence and kids stabbing each other and beating each other up and gangs and stuff is that they feel that they have to essentially sort out their own disputes amongst each other because they don't feel they can trust the police. Mm-hmm. If their life is in danger, they don't feel they can trust the police. Yeah. And the police...
That's like the rule of law. It's that's how important it is to society to run efficiently and well. And if you've lost faith in that...
Indeed. I think the police don't ask themselves questions about why these young people do not trust them enough to take their conflicts and disputes to the police rather than sorting it out amongst themselves. And the police don't ask themselves that. Instead, they just criminalize them more and more and come up with concepts like joint enterprise, which essentially is a legal tool that means that people who are even associated with somebody who does a crime can also go down for it, which then in turn fuels the distrust, which then in turn leads those kids to keep sorting out conflicts and disputes between themselves. So that it's a big problem. There is some hope though. There's amazing youth-led organisations like the Forefront Project, which when I won the Jhalak Prize, I donated my money to the Forefront Project, and it's run by an amazing young woman called Temi Mwale, and she treats youth violence not as something to be criminalised, but a public health crisis. She says this is about children's mental health. It's about conflict resolution. It's about a large amount of things. It's not just about criminalising a young generation as violent. So there is hope on the horizon. I don't think the police are helping though, and often the government just respond by saying we just need to keep stopping them and searching them. We just need to keep stopping the kids and searching them on the streets, which, you know, if you a young person in London and the police keep stopping and searching you, how much confidence do you have to go to them when you feel like your life is in danger or you've been the victim of a crime? So,
well, speaking about getting stopped by the police, this was maybe six months ago. I went through an orange light all the way through. It didn't turn red. I went all the way through, and the two policemen in the car, they pulled me over and gave me a ticket. What can I do? And I was furious, and I thought of perhaps bringing it up with whomever, but it's just too much of a pain to do that. But that happens systematically in England and America, certainly.
I don't know what the significance of an orange light is.
Oh, just driving through the traffic light.
Oh, I see.
And they're telling me I drove through a red light, and I didn't.
Okay.
I went through an orange light. I found that to be unjust, the way I was treated. But again, that doesn't happen very often to me. It might happen more if I was black. There are a lack of British films about black people. Is it racist, or is it just economics?
In terms of the film industry, I couldn't speak to it with any sort of level of expertise. I can think of a handful of great black filmmakers who you could speak to.
But you bring it up in the book.
Oh.
You bring up the fact there's a lack of British films about black people.
Oh yeah, I think I'm quoting the actor David Oyelowo.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't pronounce his name either.
Oyelowo, yeah, it's Nigerian surname. He was really interesting in that context because that was the perspective of somebody who was trying to get a project off the ground. I think one of the most interesting things that the book has brought me into contact with is lots of black people in the creative industries who speak to me about the difficulty of trying to get funding and getting their projects off the ground.
But the argument is probably primarily economic rather than racist. No, that's what I'm thinking.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure what the pushback that they might have got from commissioners, but
yeah.
I mean, I think that the economic argument is...
They have to make money. They want to make profit.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, look at the success of something like my book. I think it sold almost close to 250,000 copies in the UK. It was in the bestseller list for 6 months. So the argument that nobody wants to hear marginalised narratives is becoming very much debunked. In fact, there are lots of comparison titles that have been published in the UK after my book just in the last 2 years. Like, there's a thirst, there's an appetite, there's an excitement at the moment, and not just from the people affected. Everybody's curious, and so I think that the argument that these things aren't going to make money is
red herring.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and even look at the African American films that have come out worldwide recently.
The Academy Award winners too. Yeah.
Black Panther, Moonlight, Jordan Peele films.
Yeah, love those.
They're packing out the cinemas. Everyone's going mad for them, and so now would be the time, I think, if I was a commissioner, to throw money at something like that. You know?
Yeah. These are just basically stats and things that you put into the book. For example, the fact that 70% of profs are white men. Black men have double the rate of unemployment. They're twice as likely to get charged with drug possession, despite lower rates of drug use. We do not live in a meritocracy.
Yeah, I think you can't look at those stats and think that we do, you know. It's so drastic. And, you know, as the years go by, those stats are getting old. Some of them are a decade old. Mm-hmm. Some of the more recent ones are at least 3 years old, you know, because I was writing it in 2016, right?
Yeah.
But I doubt if you reproduce some of the studies that things would have changed drastically. But yeah, you can't look at some of those statistics and think that we live in a meritocracy and that everybody has access to, equal treatment under the criminal justice system, or everyone has equal access to education and stuff. It's quite mind-blowing, really. And, when I was working in an anti-racist think tank years ago, part of my job would be to collate these reports that would come out from different organisations and sometimes from the government. And after a while, I was like, somebody really needs to knit this information together and create a timeline of somebody's life to show how that disadvantage interacts with them. And that's really what I try to do with that particular section in the book, where I really go in on statistics, is to really say, this is what this looks like as a tapestry. All of these reports about racist disadvantage, this is what it looks like as a tapestry over the course of someone's life.
Well, you talk about white privilege and the fact that race will almost certainly positively impact my white person's life trajectory, and I probably won't even notice it.
It's the flip side of those statistics, isn't it? If somebody...
Well, nothing's happened. In other words, I've had challenges, all sorts of challenges, but I guess I haven't had obstacles put in front of me that might otherwise have been there.
Indeed. I mean, the flip side of those statistics that show drastic racial disadvantage is, other people are benefiting from that. So, I use a stats from the Department of Work and Pensions that show that people with an African or Asian sounding name, when applying for jobs, were much less likely to be called into interview than people with white British sounding names, even though they had similar qualifications and experience. So if people who have funny foreign sounding names are less likely to be called into interview, then it stands to reason that people with white British sounding names are more likely to be called into interview, therefore more likely to get the job, have access to that earning, that earning power, which means you can pay your rent, you can pay your mortgage, you can save. Yeah. And that's really what I mean by white privilege. So people are benefiting off that drastic inequality. And what I don't mean is that those people also don't face their own personal struggles, whether that be for other forms of discrimination. It could be sexism, it could be homophobia, it could be class discrimination, and it could be outside of discrimination. It could be, challenges, it could be death in the family, it could be personal illness, mental health. I guess white privilege is not really about saying that white people don't suffer challenges and struggles in life. It's really just to say that...
they could be a lot more. It could be a lot worse.
Well, yeah, they're not dealing with racism in particular. In fact, the racism is benefiting their life trajectory,
Racism is a prejudice plus power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes when it comes to public discussions about racism, there's an argument made, it's rather socio-biological. It says, well, we're tribal. Everybody wants to just be around their own, people. And my argument is that this isn't about flattening the power in the conversation here, I know that there are black people and there are people of colour who are prejudiced, some black people don't like Asian people,
Well, I was going to say, in fact, you look, it's even worse than that. In Africa, you've got Rwanda, for example. There's wicked racism within the black race.
And I guess my argument is that, well, I can't speak specifically to Rwanda, although my understanding is that discord was sowed by colonialism initially, wasn't it?
Don't know.
In fact, to go back to the beginning of this interview, the top of this interview, I think it's a perfect example of divide and rule, actually.
Okay.
But I guess, when I speak about the British conversation, well, I grew up in London, hugely multicultural. Yes, there was anti-blackness amongst Asian communities. There was prejudice, inter-prejudice here, there, and everywhere. But ultimately, a lot of those people didn't have the power to affect the other person's employment, or they weren't their landlord, or their teacher or something like that. And that's why I say it's prejudice plus power.
Yeah. there was prejudice without power, which is what you're talking about, and then there's what, because the white supremacy is what designates racism.
Yeah, but I would say that supremacy is not necessarily only in the minds of white people. It's an ideology, you know, in the same way that capitalism is. And so there's plenty of people who dole out that prejudice who are not white, you know. It's an ideology, first and foremost. I wouldn't want to be so simplistic as to say that it's literally only white people who are thinking along these lines. This ideology is far bigger than that, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's the other and putting down the other.
Indeed, and in fact, I think there's plenty of people of colour who will exact that prejudice even if it goes against their own community self-interest, you know.
Just finally, you talk about the embattled white, quote, minority under attack, losing control of their heritage and culture as being a nostalgia for Britain that never was. I'm just concerned because I don't think there's anything wrong with having a nostalgia for the way Britain was. I don't see that as being racist, unless I suppose it's used in certain ways.
Yeah, I suppose for me it's I'm speaking specifically of a narrative that the far right pushes, in which they try to claim that everything was fine until immigrants turned up. But
right.
That's not really Britain's story, is it?
Not at all. No,
You
the
know?
class structure it was stifling.
Indeed, you know, that existed long before the days of empire. That's that ahistorical perspective. We would be remiss to align ourselves with it because it's just not. It's not the reality of the country's story of itself at all, and that's really what I mean. But also, I think trying to conceptualize a monocultural white Britain also is not in line with Britain's empire story. It's not, you know. Britain as a country has been very outward facing for a very long time in terms of colonialism. That is a fact alongside a concurrent story that some people try to tell, which is that Britain's a pure island that shouldn't be touched. It's just, it's strange to me that those two stories exist at the same time, and it feels like the latter story, that Britain is a pure island that has never been touched, and you know, this kind of protectionist nationalism that's often pushed by empire apologists, I suppose. It's it's like a double think, really. I feel like you can't uncritically defend empire and then also be a purist white nationalist, because if in the name of the country there was all of this attempting to conquer parts of the world, that does mean that people from all around the world are going to be drawn to the country hundreds of years later, you know. And I feel like that's squaring that question is something that Britain is still trying to deal with, you know, still very much trying to deal with. But also, you know, back to sort of the top of my answer is I think that one thing that Britain's white nationalists can't answer for is the class system, you know. And I think I even say it in the book, even if you drove all immigrants out of town, you know, people would still be poor, you know.
Yes.
People would still be poor. There would still be a unjust distribution of resources and opportunities. It's not the whole answer to ending inequality. So, yeah.
You've been going at this for how long now?
Well, the book came out in English on the 1st of June 2017. We're in May 2019, so it's almost 2 years since I've been speaking about this book in public. And
you're still I don't know if you were more passionate before, but you're still, from this viewer's eyes, as passionate about this as you were before, or?
Yeah, I mean...
You haven't lost anything.
What
much drives you?
I still very much believe in the message that the book is putting out there.
And the fact that there's still a problem, obviously.
And, you know, I've been dumbstruck by the demand that the book has had all around the world. It's
Yeah, how many different languages is it translated into?
I think we're in 6 languages now.
Right.
French, English, German, Polish,
Spanish?
Brazilian Portuguese,
Okay.
Dutch, soon. Dutch isn't out yet, and Brazilian Portuguese isn't out yet either. I can't remember. Swedish.
It must be fun to look at the different covers.
Oh yeah, it's great. So it's endlessly interesting to me to meet people in different countries who are tackling these issues, and the issues are always so similar, you know, so similar, which sort of speaks to the scale of the problem. It's endlessly interesting to me. Yeah. What drives me? I don't really know. I mean, now it feels kind of like my job, you know. I guess it is my job to poodle around the world, talk about structural racism, really. One thing that I do is try not to speak about it in my private life anymore.
About it?
About the topics of the book in particular, in my private life. I keep that for public work.
You don't mention it to your pet rabbit then?
No, I don't. We just talk about hay, and because she really enjoys eating hay. I try to keep my private life actually as non-political as possible now, because all the public life is all very political. So
just finally, you've got a pen on your arm.
I do, yes. It's a tattoo. I got it in Melbourne, Australia last year. Yeah.
What kind of pen is that?
It's a biro. It's like a ballpoint pen.
And why?
Why? Well, writing changed my life. I like a good biro. I was feeling spontaneous one day.
Drunk? Were you drunk?
I wasn't drunk, no. I've never been tattooed drunk. It's something that I just really wanted to do, so I just found a tattoo artist.
That's great.
Got it done, yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
being
for
so
having
articulate.
Me. Thank you.
I've been speaking with Reni Eddo-Lodge, who is the author of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. That's published by Bloomsbury. And what about in the States? Is it?
It's Bloomsbury in the States as well,
States?
yeah, and in Canada.
Okay, that's easy.
It's also in French here, published by the publisher L'Éditions Autrement.
And that's Quebec or French publisher?
It's a French publisher, but the title is different in French. It's called Racism is a White Problem in French, but I don't know what the direct translation is for that. So someone's got to look it up.
Thanks again.
Thank you.